Welcome to ESG on Tap. We're here to celebrate all the great work that's been done in ESG over the last few years, to look at the improvements and the opportunities going forward, and also to look at challenge areas and ways that we can improve.
So what better place to be than the Occidental Hotel, where people come, talk about their achievements, talk about their success, and then also brainstorm how we can do it better.
In this podcast series, Anthony and I interview business leaders across different verticals, and we learn so much valuable information, things that most people don't know about ESG.
So what's next? Lauren's going to pour me a beer and we're going to start talking.
We have with us Guy Danskin, who is the Managing Director of Australia for Equinix. Thanks for being here, Guy.
Great to be with you, Lauren.
Can you tell us a little bit about Equinix?
Yeah, absolutely. So Equinix is one of the largest providers of digital infrastructure in the world. It's underpinned by 260 data centres across over 70 markets globally. Here in Australia, we've got 18 sites across 6 markets. So Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, Perth, Brisbane and Adelaide. Got to make sure I don't forget anybody.
So, look, I think when we're talking about ESG, data centres are often in the spotlight because of the really high power consumption that they have. Can you tell us a little bit about how Equinix is addressing that?
Yeah, look, data centres certainly are large consumers of energy on behalf of our customers, and with the advent of technologies like AI, that's only increasing. We've seen this coming for a number of years, and so we started making commitments in 2015 around our renewable energy targets in particular. We memorialised those into 3 pillars. One is that we wanted to have our entire platform of data centres globally running on renewable energy or offset with renewable energy. We wanted to reduce our own baseload emissions, and we wanted to ensure our supply chain was moving towards a sustainable future as well. And I'm pleased to share with you we're making great progress on all 3 of those. Here in Australia, we announced a power purchasing agreement in January, which will replace kilowatt for kilowatt our data centre consumption with clean energy. It's a new wind farm being constructed in Victoria called Golden Plains, and that will be available in 2029. So that closes the gap, and that takes Equinix globally to 100% by 2030.
So Guy, you've done a lot with the renewables, to help with the ESG footprint. How's AI technology assisting you to achieve that as well?
Yeah, I mean, AI, there's a ton out there, and we're learning candidly as this grows. I mean, the number one thing that we have had in place for a little while now is around climate modelling, and so making sure that we know and can predict with greater certainty, and then that means we can do things like in our air systems and control systems, we can be more efficient in how we cool the sites. We're also shifting the temperature, our operating temperature within our sites, to a higher level. So over the years, people who've been inside data centres would know they're kind of like fridge-like. And over time, we're gradually lifting that temperature so that we're not using as much energy to cool the facilities.
So that's the E part of it. So the S, so how's your company dealing with the S side around your social responsibilities?
Yeah, something we take very seriously and put a lot of energy and time into. I think there's a few things we're going to talk about here, but we created something called the Equinix Foundation a couple of years ago, which is a $50 million endowment. And then we distribute that to all the countries we operate. So here in Australia, we partnered with an Indigenous empowerment organisation called ID Know Yourself. In Australia, obviously, the Indigenous community is very important to us, and so we're able to use that endowment to distribute it around the world, and we can work with communities that are locally important, whilst bringing the kind of power of a global platform to those communities.
So in the data center industry, it's actually quite known for having a low number of women in the workforce. In a lot of countries, it's about 10% or less. What are you doing to address that?
Yeah, so pleasingly, we increased the representation of women at Equinix by 18% last year. I know we made great strides here in Australia as well, and so we're 27% for our entire employee base, so we've got over 12,000 people worldwide. So certainly trending above industry norms, but it's also something that we continue to need to work on. And so we have a number of programs globally as well as here in Australia. So here in Australia, we have one program called the Lucy Mentoring Program, which is where we work with women engineering graduates, year 3 or year 4 of their degrees, electrical or mechanical engineering, sometimes controls, and we bring them into a data center and show them what happens inside. And it's wonderful to see these young women who are studying and they've had their head in a book for 2 or 3 years, and really the theoretical when you show them that the digital economy and the heartbeat of the internet runs through facilities like ours, it really brings it to life for them. And we've had a couple of great stories where they've come in Lucy mentoring, they've come and then moved to being an intern, and then we convert them to full-time employees, and we have a few of those in our staff today.
So looking at governance, and can you explain to me what governance processes you put in place to support your initiatives?
Yeah, so from a governance perspective, 100% of our staff go through ethics and compliance training. We have also a number of our executives and leaders sitting on industry boards. So I know here in here in Asia, we actually created the Asia Pacific Data Center Association, and we have one of our leaders chairing that for us. And so really we're looking around the industry to see where there's gaps and where we can play a proactive role to help drive a more sustainable data center industry.
There's a lot of investment that goes into setting up ESG across the board. Are you finding that the investment is worth the benefit, and how are you measuring that?
Yeah, so look, measuring, there's a bunch of different ways we look at measuring, but in terms of impact, there's no doubt this is something that is here to stay. It requires investment and it requires consistent thinking. And so to give you a couple of examples behind that, we talked about environmental before. Renewable energy has moved from it's a nice to have to now customers that we're working with, particularly government and top enterprises, it's table stakes. They demand it, they expect it.
ESG is a relatively new term, and it's what makes up ESG are a number of factors that organisations have been doing for years and decades, and ESG just brings it into a framework that is reportable and people can see how well they're going. Do you think that framework that's been put in place through with the industry and the chiefs of industries getting together to develop this framework, do you think that's given you greater emphasis to move forward faster, or do you think you would have got there naturally through your normal initiatives?
Yeah, good question. Look, I think having a consistent framework, particularly for a global organisation like ours, where we are very, very large, we're distributed around the world, I think having a consistent framework for every country and region to think through and try to hit first principles of ESG. But you also do need that flexibility on a country level to be able to work with the nuance of what's happening within your country. Whether we get there faster or slower, I'm not sure, but I do think it's going to evolve. So, for example, data privacy is incredibly important everywhere, but in Australia only yesterday, right, we had another issue with a data breach, and so that would be an example of where I would see how we think about privacy moving into our ESG framework. It's there today, we are thoughtful about it, but do we need to be more prescriptive on a local level or on a global level, how we think about that?
That also helps, it gives you metrics you can compete, and compare yourself to other industries and other companies too, I suppose.
Yeah.
And learn from each other.
Well, here in Australia, we had the WGEA study that came out, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency released that, I think, in February. And we were thrilled to see that I think we were 2.3% in favour of men in terms of, obviously getting that to zero would be ideal, but there were many industries that were quite surprisingly 30% plus favourable towards men, and so there's a ton of metrics out there that we look to adhere ourselves to.
You mentioned before that there is a cost involved in becoming green and getting renewable energies, and I know a lot of businesses, particularly data center businesses, aren't really willing to pass that cost on to customers because their customers aren't willing to pay. How do you recommend companies in your industry addressing this?
Good question. Look, we're working through it. I think ascribing a value to it is fair. When you look at a PPA, they're pretty complicated financial instruments, and really what you're doing is you're hedging out in time, a price that is volatile, right? The energy spot price. And so we are taking significant risk by bringing renewable energy into our supply chain at scale, but we accept that risk. So I think there's a mature conversation to be had there with customers about how do you ascribe a value to that. But I think it's a conversation we should be having. Over time, as that normalises into the grid, then that probably goes away. But there is a genuine cost to doing this, but I think it's just a mature discussion to have.
So, with your ESG initiatives, and they're obviously being very successful, and you're across many regions, have you been impacted by any political interference? Because obviously it's so topical, and the politicians have jumped on these initiatives and really want to back them, and sometimes that's for good and for bad, depending on their agenda. Have you had that impact, and if so, how have you dealt with it?
So, not political interference is how I'd think about it, but we're very thoughtful about it. So, to give you a good example, there's this term greenwashing that's out in the space at the moment. And sometimes that's organisations with good intent and maybe just not executing or understanding exactly what they're saying in the market. Others maybe not as much. And so it's something that as an example, we're extremely thoughtful about how we articulate what we're doing, especially around renewables, but all of ESG, because there are some incredibly high sensitivities around some of these pieces. And so just making sure the language you're using is accurate is really important for those reasons.
So when we look ahead to the future of ESG, where do you see that lies? Are we using more technology? Are we adding more governance? How are we actually going to make it so it's more accessible to more companies?
Yeah, so maybe I'll tackle the E part first. So from an environmental perspective, renewable energy is the big kind of bouncing ball that everyone's following very closely at the moment, and rightly so. But there's other pieces around renewables and around the environment which are really important. So if you take our organisation, for example, how we construct these very large facilities is really important. So the materials that go into those, how can we be more efficient about those materials? And so they're things that we're certainly working with today. We've built digital twins of all of the insides of our facilities. And so we can actually help our teams navigate through a site without actually physically having to be there. And we can be more efficient in the materials we're using, the time of construction, how long we've got people on site, that kind of thing. In terms of looking forward on ESG, I think I'd probably just go back to the earlier comments around, I think it's certainly going to evolve. Cybersecurity is a huge concern at board levels across the country and across the world. We have a role to play in that in terms of physical security of data centres and the perimeters that we manage on behalf of our customers. And so we could see more of that coming in. Data privacy we've talked about, where data is resident, data sovereignty is also another key consideration. So look, I think we'll see it evolve. I think we'll see things added in. Certainly don't want to continue adding governance because it's already a pretty big burden. But there's I think some of that is certainly with the right intent.
Guy, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate conversation and your insights.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Anthony.